Hello and welcome back. This is Cole Anderson, your host as usual on The Independent Pianist. If you have been following my channel for a while, you will know that I tend to like finding repertoire that's a little bit off the beaten path. But every once in a while, I like to do an old favorite. So I've had Furley's and the Fantasy Impromptu on here before. And now I'm going to add in Debussy's wonderful Rêverie. This is one of those favorite pieces. It's not maybe as famous as Clair de Lune, but still it's up there. It's really funny for me playing this piece finally, because this was one of the very first classical pieces I ever heard as a young boy. So my first piano when I was 6 was an electric Yamaha Clavinova. And those old Clavinovas, you know, they had demos that you could activate. They're kind of a selling aid, but I used to just love listening to those demos. I remember there was one of Chopin's First Waltz. The organ sound on the Clavinova had the Vidor Toccata from the Fifth Symphony, and also Debussy's Rêverie was in there as well. And I just loved it. I had no idea what it was or who wrote it, but I just loved the kind of fairy tale feeling of it. And later on, I still loved it. I learned more about Debussy, of course, as I became serious as a pianist. And I learned about his extremely advanced works written during the 20th century, the influence that he had on later composers. And I also learned about how Debussy himself had disavowed these earlier piano pieces as being unrepresentative of his mature style. So, you know, this piece was written sometime around 1890 or so, published in 1891. So this was well before the really groundbreaking works that Debussy would write, starting around 1900 or so. Things like the Estampe, the Image, the Preludes, the Etudes, and so forth. Nevertheless, despite Debussy's own disavowal of these works, he never entirely abandoned this kind of sentimental, romantic style. You can see many echoes of it in his later works. There are famous pieces like The Girl with the Flaxen Hair and Bruyère from the Preludes, which are slightly more advanced examples of this same kind of romantic style. And Debussy wrote so convincingly in this style that many of these early pieces have stayed with us and in fact have become incredibly popular, like Clair de Lune, for example. No matter whether or not these pieces really fully represent Debussy as an innovator, they're very perfectly written and incredibly beautiful in inspiration. And the thing that I've always kind of wondered about with pieces like this is, despite their romanticism and the kind of sentimental quality to them, I still feel that a piece like this has a very quintessentially French sound. There's already a very anti-German, anti-high drama kind of approach in Debussy's works at this point, and I always wondered how he did that exactly. What is it that makes these pieces uniquely French and uniquely Debussy? Even the genre and the form are not necessarily terribly original. I mean, the form is just a standard ternary form, slightly expanded into kind of a fantasy-like form. And the genre itself is distinctly reminiscent of the barcarolle genre. You could make a connection to some of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, for example. There are some of those songs without words that are called Venetian gondola songs. And those Venetian gondola songs are very similar in effect and in compositional style. The only difference really is that Debussy's Rêverie is in 4 instead of in 3. But otherwise, they're very similar, with the left hand kind of painting the picture of the waves, the water, and the right hand having some kind of beautiful Italianate melody. So how did Debussy manage to transform this very Italianate or Germanic tradition of the barcarolle or the Venetian gondola song into something very French and very different, very ethereal, very weightless? Well, it shouldn't have been surprising, I suppose, but when I looked closely at this piece and really analyzed it, rather than simply enjoying it, I discovered that Debussy was already experimenting with many of the ideas that were going to go in very extraordinary directions for him in the next decade. So just for example, there's this very subtle use of modality, as opposed to standard classical tonality. Ostensibly, this piece is in F major, but the start of the piece, the first few bars, doesn't sound like F major at all. It sounds like we are in some kind of G key. Not G minor, but instead G Dorian. And the sound of the Dorian scale was so rare by the 19th century that it really was all that Debussy needed to give this piece a kind of feeling of otherworldly distance and magic. All he had to do was just kind of vamp on that kind of Dorian flavor scale, and he had his effect. Debussy wasn't quite ready to take this idea to its final stage yet, so he doesn't continue in this modal vein all the time. The end of the first phrase ends up having a pretty normal sounding cadence into F major. But even in his cadences, Debussy tries to avoid straightforward dominant tonic cadences. And he'll do that in a few ways, usually by avoiding root position chords or by substituting some other chord for the standard dominant chord. So for example, he might use a minor seventh chord or an augmented triad in place of the dominant chord. These were not entirely original to Debussy. Other composers like Wagner, Grieg, Liszt, and so forth had used them before, but maybe not with the kind of systematic insistence that Debussy uses in his works from the very beginning. So in this piece, there's really only a couple of classically correct cadences that Debussy very carefully places at the moments of greatest rest and repose. Otherwise, he avoids these kinds of standard classical cadences. Also, Debussy was a very important figure in the gradual inclusion of extended harmony into the standard tonal vocabulary. So sevenths, ninth chords, and so forth, which became very standard fare for 20th century popular music, in jazz harmony, for example. Those were only gradually included in the repertoire of standard harmonies for European composers. Those sort of things were generally very rare before this time. They were usually used only for special effects or particularly expressive moments. Later on in the 20th century, of course, it became rare to even have standard triads at all. So in jazz harmony, for example, you very rarely hear a triad without some kind of a seventh or a ninth added to it, at the very least. Let's take an example. I took the second phrase of this piece and unforgivably rewrote it to eliminate the kind of modal uncertainty and to include a much more standard cadence. So notice now how it sounds a lot more like a romantic composer, like Tchaikovsky or someone like that. And now, blessedly, in the original. So I hope this gives you some insight into the kind of unique ways that Debussy managed to be Debussy in this early piece. Please stay tuned. I have the complete performance coming right up. As usual, if you want to support this project, you can do that in a few ways. You can become a subscriber to my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Even $1 a month or $2 a month would be extremely helpful for me to continue bringing you this content. You can also make a one-time donation through PayPal or Revolut. I have links to that in the description box as well. Or please do consider studying with me as well. I have space in my studio for online lessons. So if you'd like to do that, just drop me a line at cole@independentpianist.com and we can have a consultation. So please enjoy Debussy's Rêverie, and until next week, take care.